cage most men live in doesn't have bars you can see. It doesn't look like a cage at all. It looks like ambition, like discipline, like having your life together. That's what makes it so hard to escape. You're not looking for a way out because you don't know you're in. What I want to show you today are 5 specific patterns, not character flaws, not moral failures, just patterns that keep smart, driven men stuck. And what Taoism, one of the oldest diagnostic systems for the human mind, says about each one. These aren't things you might be doing. They're things you're probably doing right now. Trap 1. He fights the current. The first pattern is the most common and the least obvious because it gets disguised as strength. The trapped man pushes harder when things resist. When a strategy isn't working, he commits more resources. When a relationship is straining, he applies more effort. When his career feels stuck, he adds more hours. He was trained, usually from early on, that resistance is just an obstacle between him and the result, and that the right response to an obstacle is force. This is where Taoism steps in with something that sounds almost offensive the first time you hear it. Wu Wei, it translates roughly as non-action or effortless action, but neither translation really captures it. Wu Wei isn't about doing less, it's about moving with what's actually happening instead of against it. The Tao Te Ching describes the nature of water constantly, not because water is passive, but because water is unstoppable precisely because it doesn't fight the shape of things. It finds the path, it goes around, it arrives. Most men have been trained to do the opposite of this. Think about swimming upstream in a fast river. You can be strong, technically skilled, highly motivated, and the current will still grind you down before you get anywhere. The river doesn't care how determined you are. It's not rewarding effort, it's responding to physics. A man who understands the river turns his body, reads the current, and uses the water's own energy to move. He arrives. The man fighting upstream is still out there, proud of how hard he's working, going nowhere. Wu Wei is reading the current correctly before you commit to a direction. Now, the men who get stuck in this trap are rarely lazy. That's the cruel irony. They're usually the hardest workers in the room, but there's a difference between effort that's aligned with what's real and effort that's just high-volume resistance. Taoism calls the second kind a sign that you've lost the thread, not a sign of strength. The Tao Te Ching puts it plainly in chapter 76. The living are soft and yielding, the dead are rigid and stiff. Rigidity in Taoist thinking isn't discipline. It's the first stage of collapse. Where do you feel the most friction in your life right now? The thing that keeps requiring more from you and returning less, more energy, more planning, more forcing, and still not moving the way it should. That friction is information. The trapped man treats it as an enemy to overcome. The Taoist reads it as the river telling him something about where the current is actually going. This doesn't mean you quit when things get hard. It means you stop confusing motion with direction. You stop confusing force with progress. Wu Wei asks you to pause long enough to ask whether you're actually moving or whether you're just exhausted and calling it dedication, because the exhaustion doesn't stay physical. It moves into how you see yourself. A man who's been fighting upstream long enough starts to build his whole identity around the fight, the struggle, the grind, the sacrifice, and once that identity is in place, it becomes its own kind of trap. Even when the resistance eases, he finds new resistance because the fighting is the only self he knows. That's where the second pattern begins. Not in what he does, but in who he's decided he is. Trap 2, he builds his identity on status. Most men don't notice this trap until it's already cost them something they can't get back. The trapped man builds his sense of self on things the world gave him, the title, the income bracket, the respect that comes from a certain kind of success. And for a long time that feels stable. It feels earned. Because it was earned, he worked for the position, he delivered results, he moved up. The external structure reflects real effort, so it seems like a reasonable foundation to stand on. The problem is that anything the world gives you, the world can take back. A title disappears in a restructuring. Income drops in a bad year. Recognition moves to whoever produced better numbers last quarter. The man who built his identity on those things doesn't just lose a job when that happens. He loses the answer to the question, who am I? And that's a much more destabilizing loss than the financial one. The Tao Te Ching addresses this directly in chapter 33. It says that knowing others is intelligence, but knowing yourself is true wisdom. Conquering others takes strength, but conquering yourself takes real power. That distinction matters. Most men in high-functioning careers are very good at knowing others, reading rooms, managing teams, understanding markets. That's the skill they got rewarded for. Inner knowing, the Taoist kind, didn't come with a bonus attached, so it atrophied. This becomes visible at a specific life stage. Around 50, sometimes earlier, the career plateaus or pivots in a direction he didn't choose. The title that once felt like arrival starts feeling like a ceiling. He's worked hard enough that the external rewards have slowed down, but his whole definition of himself still runs on external input. So the gap widens. He keeps producing, keeps performing, keeps signaling, but the return on all that performance quietly shrinks, and he can't figure out why it stopped being enough. What's actually happening is that the cage is becoming visible. For 20 years, it felt like a structure. Now it feels like a constraint. Same cage, different awareness. The man whose identity runs entirely on status is always one bad quarter away from a crisis he doesn't have language for. One layoff, one merger, one moment where the organization decides it's moving in a different direction, and he's not part of it. He'll call it unfair, and maybe it is, but the real wound isn't the job. The real wound is that he doesn't know who he is without it. Taoism's answer here isn't to stop working or stop caring about results. It's to locate your center somewhere that doesn't depend on external return. Not your title, but how you move. Not your income, but what actually guides your choices. Not what the world calls you, but what remains when the labels get removed. Chapter 44 of the Tao Te Ching asks a question that lands differently the older you get. Which matters more, your reputation or your inner life? Fame or freedom? The man who chases recognition gains it at a cost he usually doesn't calculate until the bill arrives. The reframe isn't about becoming indifferent to results. It's about understanding that results are outputs, not definitions. A man with a stable center can lose the title and still know where he stands. He can take a financial hit without taking an identity hit alongside it. The ground doesn't move when the external structure shifts, because his ground was never out there. That kind of stability doesn't come from accumulating more credentials, more status, more proof. It comes from needing less external confirmation to feel like yourself. And ironically, the men who get there tend to perform better because they're not burning energy managing the fear of losing what defines them. When that fear is running quietly in the background, though, it tends to express itself in one very specific way: control. Trap 3. He overplans to avoid uncertainty. Here's what control actually looks like when it moves into the future. It looks like a spreadsheet. It looks like a 5-year plan with quarterly breakdowns. It looks like research, preparation, contingency thinking, backup contingencies for the contingencies. From the outside, it reads as competence. From the inside, it's fear wearing a very organized mask. The trapped man treats uncertainty like a structural defect, something that shouldn't exist and can be engineered away with enough preparation. So he plans compulsively. He maps out scenarios, he games out conversations before they happen, trips before he books them, career moves before he's even unhappy in his current role. The planning feels productive because it's producing something, documents, frameworks, decisions, but a lot of what it's actually producing is the sensation of control, which is different from control itself. This matters because planning is genuinely useful. Nobody's arguing against thinking ahead. The issue is what the planning is doing psychologically. When a man uses planning primarily to reduce anxiety rather than to actually prepare for something, the plans stop being tools and start being a way of avoiding the present. He's not thinking about what's real and in front of him. He's mentally living 3 steps ahead, trying to pre-solve a future that hasn't happened yet, in a world that keeps changing the variables. Taoism has a concept called pu, sometimes translated as the uncarved block. It describes the mind in its natural state, open, responsive, not yet shaped by fixed categories and predetermined conclusions. The image is a block of wood before any tool touches it. All possibilities are still present, nothing has been foreclosed. A mind like that can respond to what's actually happening. A mind that's already full of plans, already committed to a specific shape the future needs to take, can't. It keeps trying to fit reality into the plan rather than reading reality as it arrives. The paradox is that over-planning undermines the very thing it's supposed to protect. A rigid plan, especially across years, leaves no room to adapt when conditions shift, and conditions always shift. The flexibility that makes a plan actually succeed is exactly what compulsive planning destroys. You can't hold a direction loosely and death grip it at the same time. This tends to hit hardest around midlife, and the mechanism is almost predictable. The plans a man built in his 30s were calibrated to the world as it looked then, to who he was then, to what he thought he wanted then. By his 50s, the world has moved, he's moved, and often the plans haven't. They're running on old assumptions. A lot of men at this stage sense that something isn't quite fitting anymore, but respond by planning harder, more optimization, more structure, more control, rather than releasing the plan and looking at what's actually true now. The Taoist move here is a specific kind of trust, not faith in a particular outcome, but trust that you can navigate as you go. Hold the direction, know roughly where you're heading, but let the path clarify under your feet. The Tao Te Ching describes this in chapter 16. Return to the root, watch what's actually happening, work with what's real. That's not vagueness. It's precision applied to the present rather than to an imagined future. A man who can do that doesn't feel the constant low-grade anxiety of trying to keep reality inside a frame he built years ago. He's not less prepared. He's prepared differently. He's cultivated judgment and responsiveness rather than just accumulating plans. But there's a version of being stuck that doesn't look forward at all. It looks backward, and it holds on with just as much grip. That's what the next trap is built from. Trap 4, he carries resentment. Like its evidence, the trapped man has a story. It's detailed, it's accurate in most of its facts, and it explains exactly how things went wrong. The boss who passed him over for someone less qualified, the partnership that dissolved unfairly, the years he gave to an organization that restructured him out without a second thought, the relationship that ended in a way he still doesn't fully understand. He holds these things carefully, like documents in a case file, because to him that's exactly what they are. Evidence. Resentment in this form doesn't feel like a problem. It feels like clarity. It feels like he finally sees people and institutions for what they actually are. And because the grievances are usually based on real events, the resentment carries a kind of authority. He's not being paranoid. Things really did go wrong. People really did behave badly. The injustice was real. What Taoism points to isn't whether the grievance was justified. It's what carrying it costs you every single day going forward. Chapter 8 of the Tao Te Ching returns to water, but not the way most people use that image. The point isn't that water is gentle, it's that water doesn't retain the shape of what it passed through. It moved through a narrow channel and then opens into something wider. It hits a boulder and goes around, and on the other side it's still water, not boulder-shaped, not slowed, not altered in what it fundamentally is. The obstacle leaves no permanent impression on the water's nature. A man carrying resentment is doing the opposite. He's letting the shape of the obstacle define him long after the obstacle itself is gone. The bad boss left the company years ago. The failed partnership dissolved. The relationship ended. But the impression they left is still running, still organizing how he reads the present, still costing him something. And here's the specific cost. Resentment occupies the space where new information could go. A man who's already decided why things fail, who's to blame, how organizations really work, that man stops being able to see situations clearly. He's pattern matching to the old wound rather than reading what's actually in front of him. The story about what was done to him becomes the lens, and the lens distorts everything it touches. This is what Taoism means by attachment producing the same outcome regardless of what you're attached to. It doesn't matter whether you're gripping a desired outcome, a relationship, or an old injury. The grip is the problem. The hand that's closed around what it lost can't pick up what's available now. For men in the second half of their lives, this is where it gets specific. There's actually more room at 50 or 55 to build something new than most men in this position believe. Not in spite of what happened, but because the constraints that defined the first act are mostly gone. The obligations are lighter, the awareness is sharper, the tolerance for things that don't matter has dropped. That's real freedom if you can access it. The access point is releasing the old story, not because it was false, not because the people who acted badly deserve forgiveness as some kind of gift to them, but because the story is finished and you're not. The past is settled. You aren't. Resentment keeps you in a cell built from events that already ended. And unlike the other traps in this video, it's one where you're holding the door shut yourself. Trap 5. He performs calm instead of finding it. There's a version of being trapped that looks from the outside like the opposite of trapped. The man is composed. His voice stays level in difficult conversations. He doesn't visibly react. He's the one in the room who seems like he has it together, and people read that as stability. He's cultivated it deliberately, usually over decades, usually because early life required it. You learn to keep a lid on things when keeping the lid on is what earns you safety, respect, or authority. The problem is that a lid and a foundation are not the same thing. Performed calm is suppression with a professional finish. The tension underneath doesn't dissolve because the surface is still. It just moves somewhere less visible, into the body, into low-grade irritability that surfaces at odd moments, into a flatness that partners and children notice even when colleagues don't. The man himself usually senses it too, as a kind of distance between who he appears to be and what's actually running underneath. He manages it rather than resolves it, because managing it is the skill he built, and he's very good at it by now. Taoism uses the concept of Shen to describe the inner life, sometimes translated as spirit, sometimes as the animating quality of a person. Shen in Taoist thinking isn't mystical in a vague sense. It refers to something you can actually read in a person, whether they are present, alive behind the eyes, genuinely engaged with what's in front of them. Shen flows freely in a person who isn't blocked. It doesn't in a person who's been performing a version of themselves for long enough that the performance and the person have become hard to separate. You can feel the difference when you're talking to someone. A man who's actually calm responds to what you say. The conversation moves. His attention lands. A man performing calm manages the conversation. He's tracking how he's coming across while you speak, calibrating his response before you're finished, making sure the surface stays smooth. One is present, the other is running a background process that never fully turns off. For men who've spent 30 years in professional environments that rewarded composure, this trap is almost invisible because the behavior got them so much. The measured response, the unreadable face, the way of never letting anything fully land, these were useful. They worked. The cost they extracted was slow and quiet enough that it didn't show up on any ledger until much later, when the stillness started feeling less like strength and more like numbness. The Taoist move here isn't to manufacture a different kind of stillness through meditation techniques or breathing protocols. It's to locate and remove what's generating the noise in the first place. The performance exists because something underneath feels like it needs to be managed. When you stop needing to manage it, not by suppressing it differently, but by actually working through what's there, the calm that's left isn't performed. It just is. That kind of stillness has a different quality. You can feel it in a person. It doesn't cost anything to maintain. When you stop performing, something underneath starts to move again. That's not a problem. That's the beginning of actually getting out. The cage was never locked from the outside. Every pattern in this video is something a man does to himself, which means he can stop. If you want to go deeper on Wu Wei or the uncarved block, watch this video next. I go further into both. Subscribe if this one landed.